You sent me this really interesting article about what it's like when you talk to someone in an uncompressed way, when you don't have to kind of contort yourself into knots to satisfy the person you're talking to or be acceptable or have your thoughts make sense to them, and how connecting that is versus how alienating it can feel when that's not happening. And I thought the article was fascinating.
Yeah, her name's Lindsay Macarith or something like that. I was just reading another one of her articles. She coins the term NeuroComplex as opposed to neurodiverse, and the similarities, differences, and melding of ADHD and autism. And it describes sort of a complex mind that's able to think a bit differently, carry on 3 or 4 different trains of thought, someone that thinks in pictures more than words. There is a compression tax, as she calls it, on trying to communicate what you actually have in your brain and have it come out in language, and how doing that repetitively and not actually being able to fully express what you think or feel is exhausting and can sort of wear on you over time.
She points out how often in that interaction you get good reviews from the people, and that's actually like even more alienating. So you maybe have a conversation where you've compressed yourself and the person is feeling like, oh, this person's so smart and kind, and you're feeling like you didn't really express yourself. Like that creates even a larger alienation gap. Maybe people like learn a fake personality that's palatable to people, which is often called masking.
Yeah, exactly. It's that masking element, or where you figure out what is socially acceptable form of communication. You never really feel like you fit in as much, or you figure out how to fit in and you're comfortable with that, but not usually always completely satisfied. And then how that impacts both personal relationships and professional relationships. I'd say that's a big part of how or why I ended up writing and creating books and creating all these side quests, so like podcasts, because I see a new person every half an hour and I'm constantly explaining things. There is just a knowledge translation from a health professional to a non-health professional that is a level of a compression tax. But when the issues that are creating a person's problem are inherently complex, it is helpful to have a neurocomplex person that can kind of appreciate all of the different facets that might be causing the problem, but then only being able to explain that to a certain point where you're like, oh, there's so much more that you would benefit from being able to see, but I either only have a half an hour to teach that to you, or you only have a certain capacity to hold that.
We talked in another episode about like, what is the future of writing? Is AI going to take away all of the writers? I mean, the reason I think no, I think we said this in the episode, is like, when a work is complex, it lasts for generations. I've read Black Swan like 8 times, and each reading is revealing something new. So it's pretty interesting to think about how art and media are containers where we compress ourselves less, or we can build something that someone else can choose to look at or take time to look at. Or the conversational framework is so difficult because you have to use this conversation, this like very sequential, time-limited back and forth volleyball game to try and like express 2 inner truths for 2 people who are totally different. In some cases, it might be that someone is literally more complex than someone else, or even just more smart. And I think there's a lot of benefit to talking to people of your same IQ level or whatever. But I also would suggest that like, there's all kinds of interesting ways to be complex and to have trouble expressing that. And sometimes it's a translation problem. It's like, how do I put this into words as briefly as possible so that you get the most complexity? And to do that, I have to reference your worldview, not my worldview. But in doing that, I have to not compress it so much that you miss the part. And in fact, if I say the right thing, it might trigger this whole unknown set of thoughts in you as a more linear thinker that will help you get the complexity. But I have to find the exact right trigger word.
Well, I thought one of the tools that she suggested in an article that was helpful, if you can see that there's 3 or 4 issues that you need to kind of address, starting with the end picture of where you're trying to get to give them some context, and then help them see that you're going to pull these threads that they're holding together. I spent a lot of time teaching loose jointed people how to improve their postures. They've got these 300 different joints in their body that are all kind of moving around. And it's a bit of a game of whack-a-mole of you try to move your head around and it's going to shift your pelvis out of place. And trying to make them pay attention to a bunch of different things is just, it's too much cognitive load to try to turn that into a physical thing you're doing. I just kind of jam them and force them into like, this is where we want to, this is what we're trying to achieve. And that feels very stiff and foreign, but then I'll give you all the threads of how to work our way back towards that.
It also puts discipline on the practitioner not to ramble. Like we've all had the doctor who just has 4 to 6 threads and they just vomit them at you, like they're unmediated consciousness. And you end up not getting a professional or clinical experience through that. And so saying, here's where I'm going, it gives everyone a roadmap and holds you accountable. And it also reminds me of this thing I saw yesterday. It was an extremely effective sales technique for this singing device where, so when you're singing, you need your bones in your face to be relaxed because they like resonate. And you have resonators above in your forehead. And like when somebody sounds really tight, it's because they're singing out of their voice, out of their throat mostly, or like in their chest when they're trying to go high. So he would like hit this hammer and it would start vibrating. And then he would hold it on their skull where it's supposed to resonate and
Yeah.
then have them make the noise and be like, you hear it? That's where it's supposed to resonate, anchoring them on where the feeling is. And then you'd pull the thing away and they would belt this thing they couldn't sing a minute ago in perfect pitch.
Interesting.
And it's like that anchor state creates something you can move towards. So at first I was reading that and I was thinking, this is very true. And this is what people say when they feel special. And actually, usually when people feel special, they actually feel like a form of vulnerable. Like you can come away from a conversation being like, they didn't get me because I'm so special. And I like that she didn't go there. And even though there's like a natural temptation for legitimately complex people to not be empathetic to their audience. She was basically like, go meditate and listen to yourself. Not literally meditate, but like hear yourself, spend time with yourself. And then she gave advice about letting people know where you're going in the conversation.
Yeah, I thought it was just about kind of identifying and knowing yourself and realizing and saying there is value in, and there's times where you do need to kind of compress and appreciate who you're talking to. But your ability to compress and decompress, that's a skill as a person to be able to be a bit of a chameleon. And I have to do that every day. If I'm treating a neurosurgeon versus a student, everybody gets hurt and you have different approaches. I find that intellectually interesting and challenging to try to figure out how to connect with a variety of different people. But if I was always having to constantly dumb everything down or constantly compress within friendships and family relations, always having to do that, not realizing you're doing that, that's where it shifts to affecting your mental health.
Yeah. And if you don't have the mindfulness that it's happening, it just kind of eats at you. But it sounds like in your practice, your goal is to deliver the complexity as much as you can. Like there's
Mhm.
a compression factor, like an MP3 is like compressed audio. We listened to those for years and years and years. And unless you like love audio, the odds that you need a WAV file, which is an uncompressed audio file, are pretty low because you can get a lot through the MP3. But then we can also remember those of us from the 90s, like those very early 32K MP3s that were unlistenably compressed and sounded terrible.
There's a nuance in finding the right level of compression that doesn't make it condescending to the person that's hearing it, and that makes it complex enough that it's intriguing or interesting for them or making sense. And that's where I think in healthcare, there's a mismatch between patients' knowledge level and healthcare professionals' time or engagement or ability to have the knowledge translation to not just label it with something and diagnose them with something and then let them go out and try to figure that out on the internet themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, that happened the first time I hired a private doctor. I'd never experienced it, where he started just showing me, "Well, this is like an axis of in your body that's like your immune system connected to your nervous system." And he wasn't trying to overload me with complexity. He was actually giving my brain something to work on that it could develop its own understandings, which is an interesting part of having those conversations because that article describes a certain kind of brain that's like hyperconnected, multi-threaded. And there's other interesting kinds of brains that have their own complexities. that are totally different. And sometimes this in autism research is called the double empathy problem. It's like two people in a conversation are compressing themselves into a mutually agreeable format. Like some people don't talk a lot. They just don't speak as complexly as they think visually, for example. And that person can often find me super overwhelming because I love to talk and I talk a lot. And there's a part where I have to like tune into what they see and communicate to them like that. And then they do a little bit of that to me. And that's a very mutual connecting experience, I find.
Again, when I'm helping people, I have to bounce between explaining conceptual things to them, helping them interiocept, feel things, see the picture of what their posture or movement looks like, because what they perceive of how they're holding themselves might be very different than what they actually see if they look at it in the mirror. Your body's this big just collection of sensory feedback loops that helps give you a sense of where you are in space. And a lot of people feel that they have to lift their head up and pull their chest back, and then they look at themselves in the front and they look all nice and posture, but you turn them and show them their side profile and realize how much your whole torso is actually really leaning backwards. And that might be why your low back hurts. Everything's just compressing into your low back, because if you only pay attention to yourself from kind of your sternum up from posture perspective, you don't realize you're stacking everything, and that's what's making your hips click and your back hurt. I can tinker with their perception of that by loosening up muscles in their body. So what they might have felt one way, and I can loosen it all, and it entirely feels different, and then help them see and show that. Part of that is physical, and then part of that is emotionally, where they're holding tension too. If they're all stressed out, that'll feed into holding tension in the same place. So they all interact with each other.
There used to be this type of learning disabled person we would talk about who is gifted learning disabled. This is still a really important category. It's just not talked about as much. And those kids have really high verbal scores. They kind of sound like some of the people in the article. And maybe their handwriting's not always super neat, or there's motor output issues. But they're good speakers usually. These are total generalizations. But working with those kids, basically, before, I didn't use this language, but this is what you say is like, this kid has so much happening in their brain and they can't get it out very easily. And the more we practice the process of putting things from this complex 3-pound mass of jelly in your brain out the brainstem into your hands, into your words, the more fluid we make that, the more that complexity can be expressed. So firstly, that's interesting. And then putting that together with what you said about how you create a clinical experience where people can begin to experience the complexity and then understand it in a way that's actionable. And that combines the physical, the emotional, and the cognitive. She talks about alienation in the article. I didn't really realize this. Yeah, it comes from the compression, because I don't mind if it's not complex. I don't mind if it's too much for us to understand today. I just want a taste of your perspective. You might just want a taste of mine. But the expectation that things are simple, that should not be complex, and that we should be able to just have a simple this is easy. I get this all the time. Like, it's easy. Just do your homework. It's not easy. Maybe it's almost an orientation towards liking complex things too that creates connection. And it's a fear of the complex, which creates the feeling of being alienated.
Yeah. I also think we put a complex kid in a school system that their brains generally move faster, and they can see the context a little bit better. And then you're like, okay, you're seriously just going to give me this one thing to do? This is stupid. I'm bored. I'm going to dissociate and do something else.
Because it might prey on that disability of, when I think about it, I get it and I see complexity, but actually to even define what a parliament is actually quite difficult for me. Maybe because I think about, the history of the parliament and this and that and this and that. And so it goes from an activity that feels good, which is thinking without a motor component, to an activity that might actually be physically painful for a person, which is like trying to take that complexity and put it into words.
Yeah, and I think if you repetitively sort of keep trying to say it's math, keep having a few negative associations with math, then you kind of dissociate, I hate math, I'm not good at math. People do that with different parts of their body too. They start to dissociate. Maybe you had like a injury of your ankle or your foot, or you had a surgery on it, or it was a source of pain. It was hurting you. People can just dissociate from them and just not really have a sense of feeling. So they just kind of learn to move other parts of them. People will compartmentalize things like that's something I'm not good at, or that's something that hurts. Everything is better, easier, or more comfortable if you learn how one thing impacts the other thing. So that actually the wiring to your foot goes all the way up through your hip into your low back, and your foot probably hurts because your back's sore. Your back might be sore because you're leaning backwards so much. So you came in with your foot being sore, but I might have to try to eventually teach you how to deal with your upper body a little bit better.
Interesting how the article we were reading is about how you could have a conversation with someone who feel alienated, but we're talking about how even in yourself, your complex parts can be your complexities, you can be alienated from your own complexities. And I don't think we're above that. And I feel like the emotions of bittersweetness, like emotions we really have trouble with these days, emotions that embody the complexity of human experience are less present, I feel, in the last maybe decade, because we want to reduce things and find that they're simple and as we're talking about, I'm like, oh yeah, I find that very culturally alienating because all I want is the complexity of this is not simple.
On this general topic, a current book I'm reading was Michael Pollan's book, A World Appears, which is his deep dive into humans' study or interest in the concept of consciousness. And he takes a more sort of scientific approach, and an investigative journalist that he is, and kind of goes through and talks to all the lead researchers that have taken a scientific view of it. He gets into the idea that we're currently trying to create sentient robots with AI, and then also realizes the limitations of science and talks to some of the literary scholars that have been debating consciousness forever, and kind of goes through that whole arc of it and trying to explain, and in the end kind of comes back to more like a monk told him to go be in a cave for 2 weeks, and kind of he came back to more of the sort of meditative state of the closer you look at it, the further away you might be from the answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's an interesting book because I've been listening to Rick Rubin's podcast, and he wrote a book called The Creative Act, A Way of Being,
Okay.
which is not explicitly trying to explain the concept of consciousness, but it's written more like his stream of consciousness. You read it, it's a really interestingly laid out book. It almost has like a little poem and then like a page and a half on a little topic of a way of being that kind of explains what it's like to be an artist. And sort of how you can tune into different things. Everything's happening around you, whether you tune into it or not, and it's a choice to kind of allow things in. People that are inherently artistic experience the world very differently, have bigger feelings, they're more emotional through things. If they're going through different traumas or hard life events, that's where their music is that much better. So I feel like sitting down and reading his book gives you a better idea of what consciousness is than actually Michael Pollan's book of
Yes.
just the whole research of consciousness. Is interesting books to read back to back.
Interesting to think about how to correlate those too. I am not a Zen guy, so I'm probably bastardizing it if you know what you're talking about. But Zen talks a lot about ideas as signposts to reality, not labels for reality, but more like pointing you. And then if you look there, you experience something real. But it's not like the literal content of the sign is the thing that you're going to be looking at. It just tells you kind of where to look. And I think both of those pursuits are long human pursuits for understanding complexity, where I would think of art as, yes, definitely everything you said, plus an output ability. Like the difference between someone with a mental health problem and an artist is that the artist takes what's happening in there and creates a representation of it that connects. And same with the intellect, like a great intellect can, I changed my career in life because of a book called Consciousness Explained that logically showed you that you could study consciousness. I wouldn't have learned a bunch of meditative practice and interioception had the analytical part not prepared me for what to look for. Even before we're talking, when you're not talking about consciousness, an artist still cares about consciousness because ultimately they see something and they want to represent it to you in a way that you see or feel something. And an artist doesn't usually care that it's even literal. It's that the piece that they made creates an interaction for you, that creates an experience for you that is real to you based on the power of that object, that art object.
At what age do you think people start to be able to understand that they see the world differently than other people? Because like, if you have a different approach to the world, or whether you're having trouble communicating, that feels isolating and feels lonely, and is probably a big piece of what drives people's anxieties. To be able to understand something like what that NeuroComplex article talked about, that okay, this is who I am. There's other people out there like me. We're all a little bit different. At what point is it most appropriate to try to explain that to people, or do you think most people start to actually resonate with that idea?
I think the answer is a little bit sad, which is that it's supposed to come from secure attachment with your parents and be non-intellectual. That every time you go out on the circle of security and come back, you're accepted in your full complexity and seen for your full complexity.
Coming back to our first episode called The Importance of Being Weird, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And maybe this one is like the safety to be weird. Like if you're raised in a way that it's safe to be strange and to be different, and your parents delight in your complexity, including some of your problematic complexity. Maybe they don't delight in it, but they fully accept it and they're not trying to reduce it. And I'm sure as parents, we've done that. Like nobody's perfect at that. I think part of the answer is like once you start realizing you're suffering because you are not securely attached, then you become pretty motivated to go like, what the fuck's going on here? And that creates a bunch of understandings like, oh, I'm weird and different. And then I went to a school where if you were weird and different, this was the representation. Like the history of psychology, this approach is everywhere, or attachments from the 60s and 70s, where it's like you realize you're alienated and then you trace it back to when do I feel safe?
Is there a role for that to happen within the school system, or is that more have to come back from the family unit?
I don't think it has to come from the family. In fact, to bastardize this study, there's a study showing basically it comes down to allo parents, like people who are not your parents. There's this one study where all the preterm babies in Hawaii were measured for a couple of years. And basically, if they had a person in their life who was not a parent who fully understood and accepted them, they had huge resilience. So, and if you think about how therapy is generally effective, like the fantasy of therapy is that you walk in, you get some great advice, you go, I never realized that, and now your life is different. That is not how therapy works at all. You walk in, you do some fucked up emotional pattern. Your therapist doesn't respond like a parent. They still respect you and give you unconditional positive regard while giving you clinical treatment. And you learn that you're acceptable in your full complexity and your shame. So I don't know. To teach that in schools is to have kids be around people who treat them like that, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, packing 30 people together, 30 kids together, they're all going to be assholes to each other. Like chunks, not all.
Well, it shows me when a teacher gets a vibe going in a 30
Yeah.
person classroom where everyone does, like it's not often, but it happens.
Yeah.
Like, holy shit, that's master work.
That's the leadership role of being a coach on a team or a teacher in a group of, trying to create a safe but challenging environment for everyone, which is easier said than done.
And where you see people's individuality. I had one year in baseball, shockingly, not the best baseball player. I'm sure you're surprised. And I did quit. Like it wasn't a fun year, but I was like on the bench. But I definitely was treated with respect. And I was treated like I was on the team. And I liked going. I liked being there. It wasn't an alienating experience. It made me realize I didn't want to play baseball. But being able to be like kind of klutzy and more interested in the game than the technical part of the sport and simply just not that good at it didn't cause a rejection, but it also didn't cause someone like trying to turn me into that. I was just kind of allowed to be there. And it was really good for me.
That's great. I coached my daughter's baseball team when it was like the last year of pitching machine things. And it was mainly a boys team. There's two girls, my daughter being one of them. And she was clearly the worst player on the team. She didn't care. She was little. She was doing cartwheels in the outfield, picking daisies, and she's grew up with two older brothers. She's used to being around boys. She's doing bottle flips with the boys in the dugout, and
Amazing.
I think she struck out 98% of the time. But a lot of the boys on the team we had some of the best kids in the league, and we won the whole championship. And she got one hit, I think, in that final game, and she was out, but it was an RBI, so she brought a run in. That's what she remembered, and she knew she got an RBI, and she dropped the mic. She's like, "I'm not playing baseball anymore."
Yeah, I peaked.
Yeah, yeah. It was a participation sport for her, and she won the championship.